So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dana Crystal. I am a conservation specialist working with the producer-led program at DATCP. Joined with me today on the Zoom is also Rachel Rushman, our program manager. And we're also lucky to be joined by Mike Tiboris. He is the Clearwater Farms Director at the River Alliance of Wisconsin. So he's going to be talking today about some of the steps and different things to consider when thinking about obtaining nonprofit status for your farmer-led group. This is something that's come up several times recently, and so we wanted to provide this information for the network for those of you that are interested in maybe going down this path. So with that, I will kick it over to Mike to go through this presentation.
Great. Thanks, Dana and Rachel. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. I think this is really good timing for this because we also have gotten a lot of requests and interest in this. And so what I'd like to do, I'm really happy to see some familiar names on the Zoom there. There's been a lot of interest in supporting this. What I'd like to do is kind of lay out just sort of general thoughts about becoming a nonprofit, why you might want to do that, why you might not want to do that. And what's involved in the process, and then to kind of get you thinking about how you would start that process. And I'm going to emphasize as we go repeatedly, how much thinking you should do before you make this kind of decision, and what sort of thinking might help clarify that for you. But before I go into that, I'll introduce myself. So I'm Mike Tiboris. I'm the Clearwater Farms Director for River Alliance of Wisconsin. I direct the agriculture and water program there. River Alliance of Wisconsin as an organization is we're coming up on about 30 years old. We're a statewide organization that, although we've got rivers in the name, we kind of work on water issues across the state. And we have approaching a couple thousand members, many of whom are small lake and river associations. And one of the primary things that we've done is provide support and organizational resources to these small, often volunteer organizations. And there are many of them. There are many organizations across the state working on water protection, among other things, that are not officially nonprofits. Some of them are, and we serve as a kind of intermediary for them. So one of the things that we've noticed over the last few years is that there's a growing number of producer-led groups supported by the DATCP grant, and also just sort of popping up because farmers are very interested in conservation. They're very close to the land and water, and it's not surprising. What we've thought is that they're very much like lake and river associations that have kind of populated the space of water protection in the state, and they deserve the same sorts of support and resources, and to think about how they might build longevity as groups. So we're really excited about that, and we want to help support that process where it makes sense. So the first thing to note about being a nonprofit is that there's a lot you can do without becoming a nonprofit. And so the first question you have to ask yourself is it a thing that you want to do and need to do for your organization? And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on this question, how you might settle it for yourself, because while we're really excited to see more farm groups kind of lead the way in this sort of role, we want to see strong groups that can survive and can attract the kind of support that they need to exist over a long time. And it's possible in this context to put the cart before the horse. And we get potentially good organizations that might fail because they go for nonprofit status too quickly, or because they're just not ready, or they don't need to do it to achieve their goals. And so we want to avoid that outcome. So why do you want to become a nonprofit? There's a bunch of questions you should ask yourself right out of the gate. Currently DATCP, the grant allows groups to receive funds through a fiscal sponsor, usually a county conservation office, sometimes other nonprofits. And so the status quo is to have kind of informal, smallish groups of farmers working on conservation issues that have a fiscal sponsor in another organization. So this would be becoming a nonprofit would be moving out of the wing of that organization and becoming a kind of your own thing. So is that a thing that you want to do? Is there a need for that for you as an independent group in your space? And I think that there's a lot of energy And so it's really natural to hope that you want to have a self-standing group. And so you just want to ask, is it something that's necessary? Are you specially positioned as a group in your space, or are there similar groups that already exist that you might collaborate with and work on the same sorts of projects, or join with and form a more substantial group? Do you need an organization that's going to live on beyond the existing members in it? And I think this is a kind of core question about nonprofits. Are you trying to build something that, you know, maybe the founding members will someday move on to other organizations, or they won't, or they'll decide that they can't be part of it anymore? Do you want the organization to survive through that and continue on regardless of who occupies those roles? Or are you just focused on getting a handful of projects done, which is important, but maybe you don't need a nonprofit to do that? Another question you should ask is, do you have a core group of supporters? 5 to 10 enthusiastic supporters makes a group that can do a lot of work and be quite successful, but you'll likely need to grow your support over time and make sure that you're bringing new people into the organization. And so this naturally leads to another question, which is, who's going to do the work of keeping the organization going? Often we see in small new groups that there are a handful of people, maybe 1 or 2, who really take the lead on most of the projects in the group. And it becomes potentially a problem when those couple of people are really the central workforce of the group. What happens when they get tired, or what happens when they can't do the work anymore? Do you have not just an enthusiastic core group, but do you have a way of bringing new people into the organization, new kind of worker bees who can do the continuous maintenance tasks of keeping a corporation functioning? Another question you should ask is where you'll get the money to do this. At the moment, a lot of the DATCP grants are administered on a reimbursement basis, and so a lot of what a lot of groups are doing is they have a fiscal sponsor who handles the upfront costs and then applies for the reimbursement. In order to be a nonprofit, you'll have to handle that money yourself, and so you'll have to have cash on hand to do the projects you want to do. So where will you get that money? Are you limited in the kinds of funds that you have right now, such that you need more and you can't get it without becoming a nonprofit? Does becoming a nonprofit cut you off from other sorts of funds that you currently have? You have to do this assessment before you make that move. And then finally, do you have a plan? Not just an idea, not just a good idea, but a plan for how your organization will achieve that sort of thing in fairly specific terms. What are your goals and tactics for doing it? What sorts of activities are you going to do, and how will you accomplish them? How will you fund them? Who will be the people who will carry it out? So let's consider some reasons why, given all that stuff, you might want to become a nonprofit, and some reasons why you might not want to. One reason you might want to, and probably the biggest reason, is financial. There's a lot you can do as a volunteer group or a group of just sort of collaborators on a project that doesn't require this formal status, but you might want to do more. You might want to raise money, for example, from individual contributions from members or from people more broadly. In order to do that, you're going to need to form the kind of fiscal group that can do that, that can legally do that. If you want to apply for grant funds, sometimes you need to be a nonprofit to do it. There are definitely grants out there that require you to be a nonprofit to receive them. And there are also other places that require you to partner as a nonprofit with an organization to get the grant. DNR grants, for example, require that you have members sometimes. So if that's true, you might need to be the kind of organization that has members, which maybe would encourage you to become a nonprofit. You might want to have more freedom about the kinds of projects that you need. If you're a nonprofit and you have your own funds, you can direct that to a certain extent. You wouldn't be reliant on grants that just sort of direct you to do certain sorts of projects. And the final financial thing is liability and risk management. Like a business, the risks in a nonprofit are held by the organization, by the corporation, rather than individuals in the group, and that can be attractive. Another reason you might want to form a nonprofit is to build an organization that will grow beyond its founding members, something that will live independently of the people who occupy the organization. And in order to do that, you have to have a separate kind of organization. And so you should ask yourself what sort of organization you want to be. How would you characterize what you're going for? Here's a few ideas. I think these kind of cover the main types of organizations, and you see mixes and matches of these. You know, it's uncommon, I think, to have groups that do just one of these things, but I think these are kind of the big categories. There are groups that focus on convening and facilitating. That is bringing shareholders from a community together to identify a common problem and address it, to collaborate on it. For example, a lot of lake associations and river associations do this sort of thing. They bring people together and educate them about water protection in their area. Doing events, educational events for your peers, for example, field days and demos and field trials and things, those can be convening and facilitating types of activities. Or maybe you're the sort of organization that wants to lean more on implementation, doing stuff. You want to lead and complete specific concrete projects, maybe grant-funded projects under a timeline. Here, I think of cover crop programs, soil and water testing, the kinds of things that you would get a grant for specific sorts of activities that you would implement on individual farms in your area. And finally, another kind of group you might be is a group of advocates. That is being a voice for your community or for your industry to promote an idea or an issue of concern, and identifying solutions to particular problems that you might share and try to influence them to be accepted more broadly. I think it's uncommon for organizations to not have some element of these, but I think if you're driven by these sorts of things and the group that you're in is driven by these sorts of things, that's a reason to consider forming a more substantial group or a nonprofit. Some reasons that you might not want to be a nonprofit. Oops. Okay. The biggest ones are that I think that it's just not necessary, right? I mean, if it's not necessary to achieve your goals, it is a different sort of activity. And in particular, I have in mind here, if you have very narrow goals, like for example, if the goal is just you want money so that you can put signage up for field signs, that's the sort of thing you probably could handle on a small grant basis that wouldn't necessarily require building a larger organization. If, however, that field sign program is part of a broader campaign to educate the public and to bring in money to do more projects on more farms, then maybe you do need something more substantial. So if it's not necessary to achieve the goals that you have, then it's a big lift. If you have a stable and adequate fiscal sponsor already, you might not want to become a nonprofit organization. Many of the producer-led groups, I think, are in this position where they've got a good relationship with their county conservation office or whoever is managing the grant, the DATCP grant for them, and that's enough money and kind of covers the project. And there are benefits to that. Usually the fiscal agent adopts some of the responsibility that would normally have to be taken on by a group if they became a nonprofit. So for example, financial, coming up with the money to front for particular projects, insurance, and administrative staff. And I think for a lot of groups, a lot of producer-led groups, the administrative staff is a big hurdle because you get a group of farmers together and they're energized and excited, but there's a lot of administrative work that comes along with a group, and finding somebody who can play that role is pretty critical to having a group function. If you have a fiscal sponsor that is willing to provide some time from their staff to do that for your group, that's extremely valuable. And the final reason that you might consider not becoming a nonprofit is if you're not sure that your organization will survive the transition. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of prep work and to becoming a nonprofit. And then once you become a nonprofit, the organization kind of has a life of its own. It's got its own bylaws. It'll have its own board. It'll be something separate from the original kind of core group of people who got together to create the organization. And if you don't build that structure pretty well, it's possible for it to just become too much for people to handle, for it not to have that same amount of energy. And if you aren't pretty sure that the organization can survive that transition, you might not approach it. You need strong leadership to make that transition. You need to be focused on pretty clear goals for the group and have a sense that it can survive in that setting. So how do you do that? How do you make sure, if you're not sure here and you're thinking about this, how do you make sure that you're ready to do it? Well, I think it's very important that you set up a strategic plan. You have some clear strategic thinking about your leadership, about what the critical projects are. And you know what? I think it's a good idea to do this regardless of whether you decide that you're going to incorporate as a nonprofit. A group should have a good sense about what its leadership goals are like and who's in charge and what the future for the project is. This is far more difficult and involved a task than just the paperwork required to become a nonprofit. I'll just put that forward. The paperwork to become a nonprofit is not terribly complicated. There's a little bit of money involved, and I'll talk about that in a second. But all the work of a good nonprofit organization happens before that point. All right, in setting up an institutional structure for an organization that is going to survive and function well and be useful for achieving your goals. So, okay, let's assume that you want to become a nonprofit. You've considered it. You've agreed in the group that you want to do it. And now what? How do you go about doing that? Okay, well, so regardless of nonprofit status, as I said, I think it's important for all organizations to create a strategic plan. But if you're going to incorporate into a nonprofit, then it's the very first task that you need to do. Much of the actual process of forming a nonprofit is codifying the leadership structure and the strategic plan into formal processes that you can use over time and rely on. So that's a lot of where a lot of the work happens. And so you should take time to build your strategic plan first before you file to incorporate. Don't wait until after you incorporate to do this organizational work. Some of it you have to do to file, but you could do a lot of it that's before you do that. And I think it'll give you a really clear sense about whether or not you're ready to make that leap, and also what the organization will look like. So you can start with a mission statement. I think that's really important, and a lot of groups have that. But you should also make sure that you have a clear sense about the group's goals, function, and its organization. What you want: statements of vision, projects, a sense about what you'll do, when and why you're going to do those things. You want to have a sense about who will support the projects, where you would like to go, and how you'd like to get there, and how you'll fund getting there. You should think about all this stuff first. I also encourage you to sit down and make an annual plan for your organization before you decide to incorporate. What would an annual plan look like for your organization? It's way better to do this stuff in advance and then get through halfway through it and say, you know what, this is not what we want, than it is to get into the process and say, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff that we got to do that we're not prepared to do. So getting a real good sense about that in advance is pretty important. Other things you should do in advance of actually filing for status: you should identify who your potential partners are. You should look at who might be a supportive partner for you over time. The county conservation offices, extension, other local watershed organizations and groups in your area, statewide organizations like River Alliance of Wisconsin or Pheasants Forever, maybe national organizations like Sand County or the Nature Conservancy. You should look to state agencies and local businesses, and you should map out. Suppose we start this organization. Who's going to be our supportive partner network? Who's going to help us think through this stuff? Who's maybe done some of the things that we want to do, and who would make it easier for us to do it so we're not reinventing wheels? A good sense of that really helps. You might find that there are quite a few other groups that would be very happy to either work with you directly or could give you a lot of information about how they went about doing it. And that local knowledge is very important to share. You should spend some time thinking about what the leadership structure and membership structure of your organization will look like. A nonprofit is different than just an informal group in that it's required to have a board of directors that's independent of the members of the group. You'll need to think about who's going to play that role. You may have an executive director who handles the day-to-day operations of the organization, separate from the board even. You may have staff that you need to pay and have a role for in your organization. What does that look like? Do you need those people? I mean, you legally have to have the board, but do you need people beyond that to do the administrative work? What's the organizational chart look like? Who does what? Will you have members? Some grants, I mentioned DNR grants, require that you have members in order to apply for them. A member here, the definition of that is basically just anybody who has membership rights in a corporation in accordance with the articles of incorporation and the bylaws of the organization. So anybody who's got some kind of membership rights to vote, participate, or so on. What does that look like? Do those people need to pay membership dues? Do they get to vote on things? What sorts of things? Who are you envisioning here? Is it just farmers that you work with, or do you want a broader membership of support that includes community members and non-farm, the non-farm population? What will the budget structure and financial structure of the organization look like? Will you have a fiscal sponsor? Will you have how will you raise money? You should keep the focus on who you want to be rather than having to raise money out of the gate, I think, ideally. So if you're thinking ahead about being a nonprofit and you think we have a really good idea, we're really excited, but we just don't have any sense about how we could fund this, then that should give you pause. You have to think about how you could actually do that, because once you make that leap, you're responsible for funding the organization. So it's a good idea to develop this budget before you become a nonprofit, so you can see kind of what that would look like and what your costs would actually be. It's a great idea, I think, also to come up with the communication strategy in advance. If you're, this will be essential for raising money for the organization, but just getting a good sense about how you will talk to people about what you do, what the strategy is for that. Who are you going to target? How will people be able to participate in your organization if they're not currently? Who will be the kind of point person for talking about those things? So that's all. So that's all things that I think you should think about before you actually do the process of incorporating. And if you've done all that, you'll learn a couple of things. One, you'll learn, have we thought this through enough that we feel confident that A, this is a necessary step for us, or at least one that could be very productive for us. B, we know who's going to support us in it. We know how we're going to support it financially. And C, we know kind of how organizationally we're going to function, who's going to be in charge, and how we're going to deal with the fact that people will come and go through an organization over time. Once the nonprofit is launched, once it becomes an entity, it exists independently of its members to a certain extent. And so you have to think about how that is going to work for you. So, okay, so that's all background to how you actually file, and I'll talk a little bit now about the steps involved in doing that very briefly. So far, we've talked about this first step already. The very first step in incorporation is to decide on a plan and who will lead it and what these things will look like. And so I've talked about these in detail. Once you have that, you need to think about how the process actually works. And so the first step in formally applying to become a nonprofit is to create your bylaws. You need to create bylaws legally. They're required by the IRS for federal 501c3 organizations. That's the 501c3 is the code number for federal tax exempt organizations or nonprofits. So they often get called 501c3 organizations. It also includes charitable organizations, but that's a different discussion. So the IRS, if you want to file for IRS tax exempt status, you need bylaws, but you also need them for the state of Wisconsin's law. So if you're going to file it to become a nonprofit at the state level and the federal level, you need to have bylaws completed. We have on our website, and I will at the end, I'll give you a web address for this. And I'm very happy to share these resources with you. We have all sorts of information, not just the things I'm talking about today, but things that will walk you through the process of creating bylaws. We have sample bylaws, the process of filing for nonprofit status, and then lots of information about how to run an effective organization, what to do under certain, when problems come up, and then ultimately how to wind down an organization when it's achieved its purposes. So we've got lots of resources there, and I'm of course available to and very happy to talk about the details of this. One of the services that River Alliance offers to everybody is to help them with this sort of thing. So we're very excited and ready to do that for you. Okay, creating your bylaws. Bylaws define the organizational structure of a group, of a nonprofit. They explain the structure of the board and its officers, how people are added to and removed from it, their terms, who counts as a member, what their responsibilities and entitlements are, how meetings will be held and how often, how contracts and money will be handled along with indemnification, what happens if the group dissolves, and how amendments are made to the bylaws. So they're kind of like the constitution of the organization. And it needs to be settled, and then that has to be included with your applications to become a nonprofit. As such, once you've done that, it's more difficult to change them than it is to do it in advance. So yet another reason why I think it's worth really doing this stuff before you decide to file, so that you can see what you have to do. The purpose of these is to create an organization that is independent of the specific members, much like the constitution of a country. Good bylaws clearly delineate these things, at least these issues, and they're specific about how they work, but they're flexible enough that they can deal with unforeseen things, and they leave enough space that it's possible to amend them over time. It's a really good test of an organization as it's deciding whether or not it's ready to be a nonprofit, that it goes through the process of writing these up. I encourage people to write up bylaws for your organization, regardless of whether you want to become a nonprofit. But it is a lot of work. So you'll see that this is a pretty robust first step. We have examples of that, and I'd like over time, actually. I was telling Dana that some of a lot of our examples of bylaws are aimed at lake and river groups. I would like to include more examples and templates that are focused specifically on producer-led groups. It's pretty similar. There's not a huge amount of difference, but there are little things here and there that you might be more focused on, given the kinds of work that you're doing, than a volunteer lake association might. Once you've got your bylaws in hand, the next step is to incorporate. Incorporation is the legal process of filing for nonprofit status. When all organizations face a couple of problems. One of them is that they are legally liable for things done in the name of the group, just like a company or any other corporation. And the second issue is that they can be considered taxpayers by the state or federal government. And so both of those things have to be addressed. Now, nonprofit status mitigates some of these challenges. Corporations can be for-profit or nonprofit. And in Wisconsin, if you want to become a nonprofit, the first step you have to take is to file articles of incorporation with the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions. Under Chapter 181, we call this a non-stock corporation. It costs about $35. I think it's still $35 plus a $10 annual fee with your annual report and some paperwork to get this status. You can, I'm going to put the link for that in the chat here so that you can find it, but it's quite easy to find if you just search for non-stock corporation Wisconsin. You'll see the instructions for that. You must do this as a first step. And you're going to need to have a registered agent that's just somebody who's a resident of Wisconsin. It doesn't need to be an attorney or anything like that, but somebody who's going to be the person who files for your organization. So that person will have to do the filing and put their information in, pay the fee, establish the group name, and include bylaws. Here's some information about what you will need for that, including, and I'll point out the most important thing here is you're going to need 3 board members when you do this filing, 3 people who will serve as the initial board members. You can have more board members than that, but you need a minimum of 3. So Wisconsin law requires that after you have filed for 181 non-stock corporation status, that you hold a meeting of your board to adopt the group's bylaws. Once the bylaws are adopted, they are considerably more difficult to change because it requires voting and formal amendment actions to them. So it's very important, I think, before you get to this step to have those hammered out in great detail and with clarity. 181 status entitles your group to hold debt and liability in the corporate name. It gives you volunteer protections. It gives you continuity of the organization through leadership changes, and it allows certain sorts of DNR grants and other grants that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And it lets you also legally hold raffles. It does not, however, make you tax exempt. Donations made to the group are not tax deductible for the people who make them. If you want that, you need a further filing. So this is the state level Chapter 181 non-stock corporation we've talked about so far. If you want tax exemption for your organization and for the donations to be tax deductible, you have to file for federal tax exempt organization status. That's the 501c3 status. This is different than the 181 filing. It tells the IRS that you want to be tax exempt. And if you're accepted, you will automatically be Wisconsin state tax exempt as well, except for Wisconsin sales tax. So to do this, you need to fill out some separate federal paperwork, and the cost for doing this is between $275 and $600, depending on some things. So the paperwork is a little bit more complicated. It would pay to have a little bit of help doing it, but it's not anything that you couldn't do, and I don't think you need an attorney to do it. It's not quite that complicated, but it is more robust than the Wisconsin state paperwork. The benefits of this are that it allows you to solicit tax deductible donations from members or from the public. So people can donate money to you and then they can claim that as a deduction on their taxes. It also makes you eligible to receive grants from private foundations. It also makes your organization tax exempt. So you'll be a tax exempt organization, and it might qualify you for some exemptions from taxes on, for example, goods and services, not just income. The details of that, it depends a little bit on what you're doing. You can get, for example, nonprofit bulk mail rates and possibly some property tax exemptions depending on sorts of things. But those are separate sorts of things that might apply to some organizations and others. But the big point here is that the organization will be tax exempt for income. There are some disadvantages, however. The forms are time consuming, it's true, and you might need some help with them. Fortunately, you have access to lots of help for them. Other organizations, and River Alliance is happy to help as well. It requires, but the biggest disadvantage here, I think, is that it requires very careful representation, both to the people who are donating to you that their donations are tax deductible, but also very careful reporting records. The IRS wants you to report your income, because you're tax exempt, in very precise ways that they like, and so you have to do pretty substantial reporting at both the state and federal levels in order to maintain your status. So there's extra paperwork there, and you're going to need somebody to kind of manage that. The other disadvantage is that it legally limits the organization from lobbying. You may or may not care about that, but it does limit some political activities, and you'll receive more scrutiny for participating in them. Generally, it's perfectly fine to participate as a nonprofit or a 501c3 to participate in advocating for ideas that you want accepted by legislators. It's great to engage those legislators in a direct way. The main limitation is that you can't campaign on behalf of particular candidates. And if you lobby, or that is, if you show up to advocate with a particular legislator for a particular bill, and you are not solicited or asked to do that, and you're just sort of pushing the idea with them, you'll have to register that information that you did that, and keep records of that. And there's a limitation on how much of that you can do without having to further file as a lobbying organization. This may not apply to you, but I mention it because it's part of this process. You'll also need a bank account and a taxpayer ID number. Not hard to get, but it's a thing you might need. We have more help on this on the website, so you are welcome to take a peek at that, and I'll put that information up in a second. So what's next? We can, if you're ready to do this, if you're ready to move forward with this, great. There's a lot of opportunity here. I think for some groups, this is a clear path and a clear choice. For others, not so much. And what we want as an organization that supports watershed groups across the state, is we want to see strong, functional, lasting, citizen level watershed organizations that are advocating for their local issues and an improvement in the environment. That's it's where most of the energy in change happens in America, and we are very supportive of it as an activity. So we want that strong functional group. We want that strong ecosystem of functional groups, and we want producer-led groups to do more of that. There's a lot of energy in the groups that we work with, and it's exciting and very familiar to us. People are jazzed about this, and they're committed to it. We would also like to see more interaction and integration with existing watershed groups and other nonprofits in your area. It's very tempting when you're a new group to think we got this unique thing and we're the only people that can carry this torch. But the reality is that there's lots of other groups that are doing similar things, and maybe you would find that you have collaborators and fellow spirits in the outcomes that you want to see. And you don't need to reinvent an organization. You can pair up with other organizations for success. And at the end of the day, I would like to, we would also like to see, and I think that we should expect groups to want to advocate for better outcomes for themselves and their communities. I think that one of the things that a lot of producer-led groups that become nonprofits will want to do over time is to take a stand on the importance of the work that they're doing and get people to see it and understand it and commit to it, and to take it seriously and adopt it as a broader and more common mode of operating, for it to become the norm in industry and society. And so that's going to require strong, self-sustaining watershed groups with broad coalitions of members that can advocate for their interests in a cleaner, healthier environment for all Wisconsinites. We have resources available to you on our website. Here's a link for you to follow. If you have any questions about this and you want to talk to me in a more specific level about your group, I'm really happy to do that. We can build plans for how you might go about this. We're happy to look at look at the documents as you produce them and have those conversations. We've done it with other groups, and it's something we've been doing for 30 years now. So we're very happy to do that. We're not selling anything. We just want to see these groups thrive, and it's how change happens. You might also look to other producer-led groups in your area. Ask them how they're doing it. Find ones that are already nonprofits. Ask them how they did that and why. And other watershed groups in your area that are not producer-led groups. You might find that they are big supporters. Here's a website at the bottom here that is local groups. We keep a list of groups that we work with. There are more than just the ones on our website. So if you want to explore that, please go there, and please reach out to me. I'm happy to help, and I'll stop right there for questions.